I would really, really, really like to welcome Donna Hemans, who's joining us today from her home, I assume, to talk about her new novel, Tea by the Sea. I'm trying to frame it properly. There we go. The one downside of all this Postal Service nonsense is that I didn't get the book until Monday. The good side of that was I had to binge this book in several days, and it's a page turner. It's absolutely a page turner. So I was so excited that usually, like, I'm a careful reader and I can be thoughtful. And this one I was very glad because I wanted to keep going to find out what happened next. So Donna, thank you so much for joining us. The first thing I'd like to ask of you is if you have a few paragraphs you can read, just so that if there's anyone on the chat who doesn't know your writing, they can get a little just taste of what they might expect from you. From you and from the novel.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this venue and opportunity to talk about craft. So what I'll do first, the book, for those of you who don't know, is set in Jamaica and in Brooklyn. And it's a story of a mother who is searching for her daughter who was taken from her at birth. And so the search itself takes place. She's living in Brooklyn during the bulk of the search, and spend some time going back and forth to Jamaica to find her child. So I'm going to read a short section from the middle section of the book, which occurs when she thinks she has figured out where her daughter is and has gone to retrieve her child. 8 years of active searching had come to this: an abandoned house, an outdoor stove and a doll. Signs of a former life, but not necessarily his and hers. No trace of where Lenworth and her daughter had gone. No trace even of the girl's name. There was no telling how long the house had been empty. Weeks, months, years. She wouldn't cry. Instead, Plum forced her disappointment deep within and buried again the words she had practiced for her little girl. There was no use in waiting, but Plum waited anyway on the veranda, her arms on the railing, her eyes trained on the hill and the roof of the house in the valley below. Her body like that of a woman expecting her family or visitors to appear any minute at the bottom of the hill. Clouds shifted in and out. Smoke rose from an outdoor fire near the house below with the rusted zinc roof. Goats let loose in the morning bleated as they made their way back home. Only when the sun was nearly down did she leave, weaving her way back down the hill in the shadows of the large breadfruit and star apple trees, and back down the long hill past Reading, through the city of Montego Bay and onto a mid-sized hotel in Iron Shore. She took with her the one-legged doll, and an unconvincing conviction that her search would end right there at the house in Anchovy. She had come up empty too many times, and each time she walked away empty-handed, she relived that first night, waking to find her baby gone, coming home to a house that was no longer hers, feeling again like a castaway abandoned at the first sign of trouble. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I really loved hearing you read it because I really got the rhythm of your writing there really well, hearing you read it out loud. So thank you. So just real quickly, in your own words, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Who are you for the people who may not know you on our chat today?
Well, I'm a writer. That's probably the only good thing or the best thing about me. But I've written, Tea by the Sea is my second novel. My first novel was River Woman, and that was published, some ages ago. And I worked as a journalist for some year, worked in corporate communications, and in between, working on fiction. And now I do mostly freelance writing, and I operate the DC Writers Room, which is a co-working studio for writers. So,
yeah, you want to plug the DC Writers Room a little more? Can you tell us a little bit about the Writers Room for those who don't know it?
Right. So it's based in Tenleytown, and basically it's a co-working space. So if you as a writer want to work somewhere outside of your homes, or now you can't work in a coffee shop, it's the ideal place to show up and get some work done. It's membership based, and we have the studio itself is just a very quiet space where those of us who can't write, who don't want to hear anything, certainly can write in a space without sound. So it certainly is open. We are practicing social distancing, and so if you're looking for a place to write, check us out. It's dcwritersroom.com, or you can drop us an email, info@dcwritersroom.com, to find out more. But it's right in Tenleytown, right across from the metro, and just easy to get to. 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Thank you. So I hinted at this earlier, but I was really blown away by the tension in this book. So at the beginning of the novel, I was sort of like, oh, cool, a family drama, lost in grief. These are things that I think topics that I'm into in literature. But by the end, I was like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen next? It turned into this really built in a very unexpected way for me because of the expectations I had when I was sort of I started on this introspective kind of nature of the family drama. And then by the end, I was like shaking, like turning pages as quickly as I could and having to go back and reread because I was reading too quick.
Okay.
So thank you for that. I love that. But how do you define tension? How do you think of forward movement and momentum?
Well, mostly when I'm thinking about tension, it's a physical thing for me. So when I think about my writing in general, or when I start thinking through how I'm putting something together, what I think of, it's like just a thread running through the entire thing. And I mean, if you imagine that thread or a rope from one end of a river to the other end, or across the body of a river with, crocodiles, alligators, whatever it is in the water below, that's the way I think of tension. So it's coming from all different angles, from the person who's trying to make his or her way across that rope without falling into the water. If there are two people on the end holding it who then have control over it, what are they doing to affect what the person hanging onto the rope is doing, from the, crocodiles in the water itself to the wind. There's so many things that could possibly affect what this one person is doing. So, that's the way I look at it. It's, like all of these elements come together to build the tension in the story and to help us as we move through it.
So was the tension of this novel something just inherent to the story? Or was it something you refined through revision, or some combination of the two?
I think it's primarily a combination of the two, but I think in some ways the tension was built just simply from the very beginning of the story. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to write the story itself. I wanted to, or had an idea to write a story about a group of people, a group of strangers in a church who were locked in this church for some reason and refused to leave. And at that point, I had no idea why they were there. So sometime after that, I started writing a short section about a mother who was getting her daughters ready for school. She took the girls to school, and she was in Brooklyn at the time and was on her way to work. But instead of getting on the train and going to work, she turned around and went to the church. So then I knew who was in the church, but I didn't know, again, why she was there. So the third part of it was that I, was in Jamaica, and there's a radio program that comes on every Sunday evenings called Sunday Contact. And a woman called in, and she was looking for her child, her 8-year-old child, and she knew that she knew the father had taken the child, but she didn't know where they were, whether they were still in Jamaica, whether they were here in America. She had no idea where they were. So she was desperately looking for that child. And so once I heard that story, I said, this is why this mother is in that church, and this is my story for this book. So I already had the tension. I already had just so much of it built into the story because I knew she would be searching for some time. The way the story itself unfolded, I didn't have at the time, but I knew that part of the tension would be the search, would be the reasons that, he had taken the child, but, primarily the search itself.
It's interesting. Do you feel, so I'm just thinking, it feels like the locked in the church aspect actually ended up probably smaller than the initial idea. Am I right there?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I imagined a completely different group of people, like strangers for some reason. So, I mean, it turned out was a little bit close in some ways. I don't want to give the story away,
Yeah.
but yeah, the original idea was not exactly where I ended up.
Is that like, I mean, you've published a previous novel as well and stories as well. So is that at all normal for you, or you have this generating moment that ends up being separate from the actual results of your idea, or is that specific to this novel?
No, I think that's overall, because sometimes I think the generating idea is just exactly that. It's that point that you jump off from. And other times it remains exactly as you imagined it. In this case, the way I imagined the story unfolding, changed dramatically during the whole revision process. I really wanted to write a story that was set over 24 hours, where this mother figures out where her child is and she goes on this search. And the story unfolds within 24 hours. I wrote a story. I ended up through the revision process with something that takes place over 17 years. It's, I mean, a dramatic difference between 24 hours and 17 years. But, within the process of revising, I realized that I needed to do something different, and the timeline itself had to change.
One quick comment to our audience. If you have questions of your own, please use the chat feature to type them in. If you're on your PC, you just hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen and click the chat button. That'll pop it up. Then you just type your message in where it says type message here. And we really hope that will be some good audience questions coming along. I have lots of questions myself, but I would much rather have yours come in here as we're chatting. Was there anything you did? Were you aware of sort of the thrilling nature of the conclusion to this? Not just the conclusion, but especially as it's ramping up towards the climax. Did you do anything in revision to heighten that? Were you aware of like increasing tension? Is that something you strive for?
I don't know that I would say I was aware of increasing tension. I usually, when I write, I have a sense of where I want the story to end up. So I think I had the last line written, very early on. I didn't exactly know how I would get to that point, but I had that line, so I knew where I wanted to get to. How we would get there was part of the process of, just building the story towards it. So it's, in some ways, I think it's just organic to the story. I like to be surprised by what I'm writing. And so I am, usually just quite surprised by, okay, really? Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're doing? So I ask myself a lot of questions. If I do A, then how does that affect B? And continue to work through the build-up through just simply asking myself a lot of questions. One, either both what the characters are doing or about the plot itself.
So I mentioned that when I started the novel, I thought it was one thing, and it kept that, but it also grew into something more. How do you balance emotional resonance, this interiority of your two main characters, with the idea of what happens next, the tension that's pulling you forward, making you want to turn the page? How do you balance those two elements? Because they're not necessarily in contrast, but I think it's a difficult balancing.
Yeah, I think in some ways it is a difficult balancing, but I think that what I did when I was working on this book in particular was that I was aware of several different things happening. One was that I knew she was searching, but the other question that I kept asking myself is, what else was driving that search? Yes, she wanted to find the child, but there was something else. And in this case, it really was a fear of abandonment and fear that, if she did find her child, would she be abandoned again? Would the daughter love her and want her? And so I think you have to, as a writer, when you're looking at the overall work is that, plot is one thing, but, what else is driving that plot? It's not just the physical things that are happening in the story. It's also what is going on internally in the characters. And so by building on that and focusing on that, I think I was able to sustain some of that interiority and focus on two things as opposed to, just writing a strictly plot-driven story.
That you mentioned the fear of abandonment, and I think that was one of the really great triumphs of the novel, is that psychological motivation comes through so clearly. So I agree with that one. That one's absolutely, I absolutely read that one the entire time. It felt so real.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the chat window for some of the questions that are coming in, which we've had a lot of. So someone hasn't read the book yet. Is the dialogue in patois?
Some of it, yes, but some of it, because we have characters who are living in Brooklyn who are also speaking in standard English. So it's a mixture of both.
How do you, this is my question, how do you deal with writing in dialect versus writing in traditional English? Is that something how do you approach that?
It's another balancing act, because you want to be true to your character, but at the same time, you want to make sure that your readers can, read and understand, because Jamaican dialect, like probably most other dialects, are spoken. And so there is no standard way of writing it down. So even for me as a Jamaican, when I'm reading something that another Jamaican has written in dialect, sometimes I have no idea what they're trying to say, just because they have spelled it in a way that I wouldn't, in a way that I wouldn't. So that too is part of the problem. But, one of the things that I think through to help me to decide which one I'll use is, what is that character's background and where is that person speaking? So somebody who's speaking in a formal setting would certainly be using standard English. Somebody, like speaking, with your family or with friends, your language will be a little bit more relaxed. And it might not necessarily be 100% correct in terms of, grammatically correct, but I hear it with a Jamaican accent. I don't know if it comes across for readers that way, but that's the way I'm hearing it. And I hope that when people are reading it, they're seeing, are hearing some of that inflections. And some of it, it's almost impossible to translate on the page, because some of it is just simply heard. But it's usually what I fall back on is, where is the person from? Is the person who is from a very rural part of Jamaica likely to use standard English 80% of the time, or not? So it's, a lot of it has to do with location and the circumstances that person is actually in.
So how was your experience writing this novel different from writing your first one? Did you find it easier, harder?
I don't know if I would say it was different. I don't know if I would say it was easier or harder. And I think in order to answer that question, I have to go back and say, when I wrote my first novel, I was in the MFA program at AU. And so River Woman was actually my thesis. So in the midst of writing that, I had, workshops. So bits and pieces of it, I, workshopped, and I, was able to take feedback from the workshops and actually, work on revising the novel. So after that book was done, I actually wrote 2 other books before Tea by the Sea. And so those other books are in various stages of revision. One, I think, is done. But I think a lot of the differences in writing were in those 2 books as opposed to Tea by the Sea. In some ways, I feel like once I started writing Tea by the Sea, I knew exactly what the story was. I knew what I wanted to do, and I wrote that one in the same way that I did with River Woman. Whereas the 2 books in between, I, did a lot of research, and I think it was harder for me to get at the actual stories, just because it required a different kind of approach that these 2 books didn't need.
So the next question is from Wendy, and I don't remember exactly what the question seems like it might be relating to something we said earlier that I don't remember, but if Donna, we'll see if you do. Can you mention a couple of the critical moments? Were we talking about critical moments earlier? I don't remember that phrase, but
I don't know.
Wendy, if you could follow up and clarify that a little bit for us, I'll definitely come back and look in the chat again for the rest of that question. Thank you. Can you describe your writing habits? Charlotte is always interested in how writers develop the writing habit and see projects through to the end.
I wish I could say that I actually have a good writing habit. It's you know, I think we, you know, are conditioned to believe that we either one should write every day or should write a certain time a day. And quite frankly, that hasn't quite worked for me, and it changes from book to book. With Tea by the Sea, for some reason, I kept waking up very early in the morning. So, you know, sometimes it was, you know, like 4 o'clock or 5, and I just could not go back to sleep. And perhaps, you know, the, you know, story was just in my head and I couldn't turn it off, but I just kept waking up, and I would, you know, just get up, come down into the basement and sit down and work. And I mean, so that's the way I completed this particular book. The others have been different. You know, now with coronavirus, you know, and the entire shutdown and the entire world changing, I don't know that I can say that any of my writing habits have survived what we're going through. And, you know, you think if you have a good habit, it should be able to survive almost anything, but it just hasn't. So I write now. Sometimes in the mornings I write, you know, if I feel that I'm not getting anything done when I'm at home, I will leave, I will change my location. And so now, you know, sometimes I will go to the writer's room. And so that might be where I work, because I can turn things off and I don't have the distractions that I would have when I'm at home. But, you know, for the most part, the beauty about writing at 5 o'clock in the morning is that I will not be doing any chores at that time. I am not watching TV. I'm not talking to anybody on the phone. It's just the ideal time, because all of those things are just completely erased. And I have a limited number of distractions that I can fall back on.
Is any part of your novels autobiographical?
No, not autobiographical in the strictest sense. I pull from aspects of my life, yes. I lived in Brooklyn for some years, and of course I lived in Jamaica. The house in Tea by the Sea is my grandparents' house. That's a house in Jamaica, is my grandparents' house, pretty much described exactly as it is, or as it was then. So, you know, there are places that I know, but in terms of a strict autobiographical storyline, no, I really draw from everything else but my own life in that, at least for the storyline.
So from Vanetta, how do themes like fear of abandonment arrive in your work? They come out of the character's backstory, or do you add it during revision?
I think it's a combination. Because usually when I am building a character, I don't necessarily know everything about the character. I know there's some people who will, before they start to write, you know, write out an entire description about what that character eats, where that character, you know, every single thing about that character. I don't do that. So a lot of that stuff are things that I discover as I write. And for the most part, the themes are things that I see emerging. And once I see something emerging, then I will go back and try to enhance it somehow. I will go back and look at places where I can make that stronger. And so the idea of abandonment wasn't something that I realized until much later on, when I had to figure out why Plum, you know, was in Jamaica, why her child was born in Jamaica. And so that part of the story, I mean, Plum was born in Brooklyn. She grew up in Brooklyn. Her parents had migrated to the States. But when she was, you know, like a teenager, one of her friends got into some trouble, and her parents decided that they would send her to Jamaica so she would finish high school there. So, you know, one of the things that I remember, you know, growing up with some of the you know, people I grew up with who were sent back to Jamaica, some felt that they were abandoned by their parents. And so that was something that I knew I wanted to build in. So once I built it in there, I realized that it was something that I could carry on and carry out throughout the story. And I found other ways to build it in.
So Wendy followed up and said, I think, Wendy, I apologize. I think I misread your earlier question, so I understand what you're asking now. So the critical moments question, she meant turning points. So how do you figure out where those moments are in the novel, I guess? And that's a really interesting question. Is that something you plan in advance, something you figure out along the way, something you don't get right until you come back to the book after you have a draft?
A combination of all of that. Usually it's, I don't know if when I'm writing, I even think of something as a turning point. I think I just know things are happening, something else needs to happen, and I am moving from one thing to another. If something happens in, one of the things that I try to do when I'm writing is think of the story on a timeline. And so part of the reason I wanted to do this story in the 24-hour window is that I would know what would happen hour by hour. And so with this one, once I stretched it out over a 17-year period, what I had to think about was what would she be doing during that time period when she was searching? What else would be happening in her life beyond the actual search for the child? So the turning points in some ways were driven by just simply by time. And I think with River Woman, it was the same thing. I had a timeline. With River Woman was I guess, somewhat different story. A child drowns in the first chapter. And so I knew that the story would take place over a 7-day period until the child was buried and, whatever else happened around that. So it really was about a week, maybe 2 weeks. And so again, it was looking at what would happen throughout that specific time period related to the various things that had to happen in order to have a funeral. So the turning points are in some ways driven by the timeline for me and the actions, but I don't know that I necessarily think of them as turning points. I think of them as what is moving the story from one point to another.
Love that. And I also love the mentioning that as you write, you're not necessarily aware of these things. And I think in talking about craft, I think a lot of craft is the stuff you do when you come back to something you finished. Mm-hmm. And you're aware of some of it as you write, but I feel like that first draft, the process of writing is a lot more instinctual for a lot of writers, and all these techniques and the way you learn to read and study writing in a critical way is all about going back and revising after the fact.
Right. Yeah. And I think too that you can tell when a writer is aware of what, like some of those things are. If you are too aware of the theme, then, it's almost forced in the story. Whereas if it's something that, comes organically, then it feels different when you're reading it.
I had early on in my writing career, I had a friend who is a brilliant editor come in and take a look at one of my manuscripts. And I think it was a simple theme like darkness. But he had literally gone through and highlighted every time I'd use that word. And I was or not any word related to darkness.
Right.
Or whatever it was. And just the fact that if that theme is there, it's going to occur without you forcing it. And you might go tweak some things later, but it will occur. And I think that's also important to know that sometimes your brain knows what it's doing, even if you're not completely on board with it yet.
Right.
So did you do any special research for this novel?
No, not really. I think because I was writing about places that I knew, it came without me having to do any extra special research. The area in Brooklyn that I used was somewhere that I actually lived. And the area in Jamaica are places that I knew growing up. So I really didn't have to do any deep digging. There are things little things you would search for to, confirm, but the kind of deep research that some books involve, this one wasn't one of those.
This strikes me too, like one of the most famous pieces of craft advice is write what you know. And I think this might be a great example of what I think that statement should mean, at least me personally, what I feel it should mean versus, so that you mentioned this isn't autobiographical.
Right.
But you didn't hesitate to use things that you knew. Is that what you think that piece of advice means?
I think so. I think it's very easy to take it a little bit too far and to think write what you know means that you just simply have to, that the only thing available to you is your story. But you certainly can widen that a bit more. And you know, for me, it's the location. There's some places that I probably can write about very easily and very well because I know them. There are other places that I would either have to immerse myself into for a longer while in order to get to know it in a way that I would feel comfortable truly telling that story. And you know, the thing about write what you know means that for some of us, our lives are going to be, our stories would be just very limited if all we're doing is writing. If you work in corporate America and that's all you know, I don't know how, you know, fun your stories will be if all you're doing is writing about your coworkers. So there is, you know, there are different things within that write what you know that you certainly can do, different ways in which you can expand upon that to make for, you know, interesting stories without necessarily having to do, you know, like something very different.
And of course, on the other hand, too, should always disclaim that that doesn't mean everything you can write about, you should write about.
There is that too. There is.
So that was just a quick disclaimer on the end of that to cover all our bases. So how did you arrive at the title of the novel and what does it refer to? Without spoilers.
Okay, well, the title itself was something that I had early on as well. And every now and then, if I come across a phrase that I like or something that sounds like it would be a good title, I'll write it down. And for some reason, I had Tea by the Sea written down. And so early on, I just wrote that down. Okay, this is the title of this book. And then I had to figure out, well, you know, like, how does this book become anything about tea and the sea? And you know, somewhere in the process of writing it, I realized that the father who had taken this child needed to have some way in which he could build some kind of relationship with the mother of build some kind of relationship with the girl who, you know, like had grown up without her mother. And it was something he and the mother used to, you know, go to the beach and, you know, drink tea. And it just became the thing that he did with his daughter on her birthday. And it worked. So I'm glad that worked out that way. But usually I use titles as an organizer, so to speak. It's hard for me to write something without having a title. But if I have a title, then it helps me to stay focused on what that story is about. Whereas if I start writing something and I don't have the title, it's harder to organize what it is or to know what to keep or what that thread is. It just helps.
So I started off asking questions about the tension, and closely related to tension is plot. And I was reading this book and following, there's two main storylines. The alternating chapters or not alternating necessarily back and forth, but they alternate between two different perspectives. They start together, separate, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything, is they seem to be heading for a collision. So why did you choose the alternating perspectives of these two storylines?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to do was explore explore one Plum, who is the mother of the child, what she went through, how she experienced that loss, how she got over that loss, and her actual search for the child. But the other thing that was also really important to me was why the father would have taken the child, what kind of an experience the child would have had growing up with him, and whether, you know, just exactly how what her life, how different their lives were after that, you know, that act. And I felt that, you know, it couldn't be a one-sided story. But, you know, actually what I wanted to do was I wanted to tell the daughter's story as well. So when the very first draft of this book that I wrote had, you know, alternated the mother, the father, and the daughter's perspectives. And I like in the revision process, I realized that it wasn't the child's story at all, because she wasn't doing anything, besides lying down and thinking about how, her father, treated her, or what kind of life she had with her father. She really wasn't doing anything, and her story wasn't moving the book along. So I realized that I had to take her voice out, and it really was truly the parents' story. It was the mother and the father, and that was what my focus had to be on. And I think once I did that and sharpened it, it sharpened the story quite a bit.
So the father to me is the clear antagonist of this. I mean, there's a side I'm on, it's not his, as I'm reading this novel. Was there any risk because he basically gets his perspective, gets half the novel. Did you find any risk? Was there any trouble along the way? And I mean, and you can disagree with me, maybe he's not as much of an antagonist as I see him, but I don't know how. Was there any risk? Did you have any trouble? Like, you're incredibly sympathetic to him, but I also wouldn't want to forgive him. Was there any difficulty along the way of keeping that balance between fully fleshed out character and being too sympathetic to someone who is the antagonist of the book?
Yeah, yes, in some ways, but I don't think I thought of him as the antagonist. I really wanted to look at his reasoning, and I think that sometimes we can do like really horrible things, or the act itself is a really horrible thing, but the intention behind it is coming from a place of something good, and that is what I wanted to explore here. Is really, is there, and how much good is there in a situation like this, where you have somebody who does something as horrible as he does? He takes a child away from the mother without any explanation and runs off, for 17 years. But his story is also it's also a question of how much are you willing to do to hold on to the life that you create for yourself. And he goes off and he does create this very, elaborate and wonderful life. And he will do almost anything to hold on to it. And I think that's important to explore as well. I mean, how far are we each willing to go? How far is Plum willing to go to find her daughter? And how far is Lenworth willing to go to hold on to the life that he created for himself? And so in that way, I think what I'm looking at is not necessarily him as this horrible person, but it's looking at what motivates us to do the things that, we actually do.
Yeah, I can't ask the rest of my questions on this. We need to post lockdown, welcome you back to the Writers Center for something, so you and I can chat about some things that contain spoilers, because there's some really beautiful writing of Lenworth at the end of the novel, and I can't give it away, but it's absolutely fantastic character growth, regression. I won't go growth. I don't know what to call it, but yeah. Anyway, it's a really, the final moment there is also like, that was a home run. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Speaking of that point, non-specifically, there's a very clear climax, an amazing climax, but I also think the novel defies the story arc. It's spread out over so much time. I don't see that, like, the cliche arc coming from left to right. I probably did that backwards for all of you watching. There we go. Okay. And there's two arcs, and as I mentioned, they almost shoot away from each other and come back. So it was just interesting how the novel was it intentional? Do you think about story arc in a traditional way? Do you think about it visually, like it's so often drawn as a triangle or as an arc? Or is it something you don't think about at all? Is it something you intentionally try to avoid as you're working on this novel?
Yeah, I don't think about story arc at all. And I think because I knew, the search, I think, had to end a certain way. Without giving away what happens in the end, it had to end a certain way. And so that to me was the driving force. How would we get from her discovering where her daughter could be to, like, what happens in the end? Were they going to be reunited? And if they were reunited, what would actually happen? How would her daughter react to her? and how would Lenworth react to her? So I think I was more concerned with answering those questions than I was with, that traditional arc itself. I don't think I ever really think of the arc when I'm writing. I'm really asking myself questions and making sure that I am answering those questions, or that the story itself answers it. And that might be, exactly how we get there throughout just about every story. It might actually follow that arc, but as I am writing, it's not something that I am physically thinking about or drawing out or mapping out in any which way. The story itself will get us there, I think, just by the questions that we as writers ask of the story and of the characters, what the characters are doing when they're doing it. And I think that, to me, feels much more useful than trying to map out an arc itself.
From Rebecca, do you use any special tools, software, techniques, etc., to keep track of characters and plot lines and all of that? And I guess the sub-question is, are you a plotter or a pantser in terms of heading into the novel?
I sometimes forget what I name characters in various parts of the book, so I I probably need to use something, but no, I usually have a notebook, and sometimes, depending on where I am, it's the note section in my phone that, where I jot things down. And I, will, I write out, ages. If something was happening in 1993, what else was happening in 1993 that I need to incorporate in the story? So some of it is just, in the body itself, the draft itself, I sometimes have just simply some things in notes just highlighted, reminding me of something that happened either earlier on, or a question I need to answer. But I probably could use some tools. I don't know what they are. Half the times it's, there's so many things to learn and keep track of that. If I can simplify my life by keeping everything in one or two places, I tend to prefer that rather than adding another tool that I need to then figure out.
So you don't think of the story arc or any structure in that way, but do you plot your story at all before you write it? Do you have points you're going to reach? Do you have goals in mind?
I think plotting in the sense that I have a timeline. I think that is it. Usually I don't know what is happening in the middle. I don't know, like in this book in particular, I didn't really have any idea how many times she would have gone back to Jamaica. As I started writing it, or I started describing various things, it made sense to me that she would, that she would be going. But once I figured out, the radio program, I knew that at some point she had to hear the radio program. And if she heard a radio program, then, what would happen after that? And I think it's those questions that help me to build the plot, as opposed to having like certain goals or certain things that need to happen at a certain point in the story. Some of it, in this case, a lot of that also happened in the revision process, where I went back and I started looking at where things took place, when they took place, and moved things around, especially with going from a 24-hour story to a 17-year story. The first version of it, a 24-hour version, just had a lot of backstory. So once I realized that I needed to shift it, I changed where the story began, and began at a much earlier place in the book than I had intended. So in some ways, the plot itself emerged because I had to change the timeline, as opposed to me looking at and thinking that certain things had to occur at a certain time.
That's interesting hearing about that revision process, because I can also sort of feel, in thinking back of the novel, how it's ramping up to the original moment, like the moment of origin is this thing that it's ramping up towards, and it feels that, and it feels wonderful. It's a wonderful feel, and that's interesting how that developed.
Yeah.
So let's talk about publishing for a little bit. We have a few minutes left, and this is the series of questions I always leave off, and I think people like to hear it. So let's talk about the story of this book. How did it go from an idea to a physical object? Where did it start, and how did it get published?
Well, after, I mean, sometime before it was published, my mother, my parents live in Jamaica, so my mother kept, calling and telling me about a writing competition that they had in Jamaica, and oh, you should send something in, you should send something in, and I kept brushing her off, and she wrote back, she called back, did you send it in? And so finally I said, okay, fine, what is it? And so it turned out to be a competition for like unpublished manuscripts, and they had several categories, one for adult fiction, one for children, and I can't remember what the third one was. And so I finally I sent it in, and surprisingly the book won. And so at that point I was still I had a full draft, but I don't think it was 100% ready. And so once that happened, I felt that like I really had a good story. I felt that I was almost ready, I was there. And so I started looking for an agent at that point, ended up with one, and we sent the book out. Once it went out there into the world, I started getting some feedback from editors, and I realized that no, something else wasn't quite right with it, which is where the next part of the revision took place, where I changed it from 24 hours to 24 hours to 17 years. And from there, we ended up sending it out again, and Red Hen loved it and wanted it. And so we went with Red Hen.
So what was your experience leading up to publication? I mean, for this book, partly too, because it occurred during this, and then also you have a previous novel too, so you have some frame of reference and comparison. So what was that like?
Well, I do not wish this on anybody. If you're ever publishing a book, make sure it is not in the midst of a pandemic and just make sure there are no protests or nothing else happening. But there was such a big difference between publishing this book and River Woman. Well, first of all, I had an 18-year difference between books. So the world was, it's like going from the dark ages to, I don't know, the electronic age in terms of publishing, because so much of what we can do now as authors and what publishers can do just simply wasn't there in 2002. At that point, I think back in the early 2000s, there were some authors who had websites. And now, I mean, you have a website even before you get to the point where you're publishing a book. So, there were some of those things that I knew I had to put in place, that I started putting in place, like a year, 2 years ago, before the book itself came out. And some of that is, like social media presence. I am, like late to just about everything, very late to Twitter, very late to Instagram, but, it's the kind of thing that, I had to do, but I'm glad I had the time before publication to begin to figure those things out, to look and to learn and to see what, certainly is possible and what else I can do, what else I could do. But I think a large part of it in this particular environment, or now in these years, is to really look at what, you are able to do on your own as a writer, and what you think a publicist or a marketing professional can help you to do. And just about every publisher will expect you as a writer to do a large amount of the publicity work. For me, I knew that there was only a certain amount that I could do, certain amount that I had the capacity to do. And so one of the things that I did early on was to get a publicist on board to help with some of the work that, I certainly couldn't do. And I think for me, it was just one of the best investments that I have ever made in my career. I'm sure at some point I'll probably do something else that, is, just as good or a better investment. But I think that as writers, we have to, one, either learn how to market ourselves and market ourselves better, or we have to figure out who can help us to do some of those things.
Did you have any input on the cover design from a fan of your cover?
The funny thing about this cover is that my editor had sent me a few pictures, and she said, just as a starting point, what do you think of these? And I didn't quite love them. So I, was searching around online, and I found this picture, and I said, well, this is something like, I have in mind something like this. And so a few months passed, and then I got a mock-up of the cover, and there was the picture that I had sent them. So I, was very happy with it, and I actually really loved the cover. I loved the girl with her back turned because I think it just really represents the child in the story and both parents' perspective of this child. So I just absolutely loved it.
Too, that working with an independent publisher is usually a different experience with covers than working with one of the big 5 publishers. My story collection came with an independent publisher. Similarly, I was like, I would like to use this artist work. And like, okay. And the thing I pointed to, they ended up using. You might have like veto power if you're publishing with a large publishing house, but they're going to send you stuff and expect you to say yes most of the time. They're not going to they're not going to give you too much control over the final product. So it's also, that's just a nice feature of publishing with an indie house. They're much, the people you're working with in a way you don't with a different publisher.
Yeah, you certainly do.
Yeah. How did you locate your publicist?
I actually found her through an organization I belonged to, and the organization had I think a brown bag or something. Some time ago, maybe a year or more ago. And it was her firm that presented. So once I started looking, I just simply, I emailed her and said, I attended such and such an event, and are you, interested, or, are you, taking on clients? And she, responded positively, and I sent her the draft of the book, and she read it, loved it, and decided that she wanted to work with me. So, one, find somebody who loves your work and who is going to put in the effort to make sure it is widely seen.
So my last question is more of a request, which is, can you please share one piece of writing advice, a craft tip, or whatever it may be?
My one thing for writers is to just simply read. Read just about any and everything that you can. If it's a horrible book, don't torture yourself, but if, I think even sometimes reading something that you don't like can help you to focus in on why it isn't working and to make sure that you are not doing the same thing in your own work. And when you're reading something that you actually do love, look very closely and carefully at what that writer is doing. Why is it working and working for you? And not that you're necessarily taking exactly that and copying it into your own work. But I think if you're aware of what is working, you will probably be aware of what is working in your work as well. And so I just say read as widely as you can.
Love that advice. So my final comment to everyone is, please, if you don't have it already, buy the book. Emily, if you'll put the link back up for purchasing directly from Red Hen Press or from your local independent bookseller. I finished this book in probably 2.5 days, and that was amidst working and being busy. So it absolutely riveted me, especially as I got towards that beautifully ramped up end climax conclusion. It was wonderful. So thank you. Next thing real quick, we are the Writer Center. We offer workshops. Please go to writer.org to see our upcoming workshops, as well as more free events like this. We hope that if you've come to this one and enjoyed it, that you'll come to ones in the future as well. We have 2 events. Oh, I should mention too, we have 2 events next week. We have a craft talk with Tara Campbell about her new mixed genre collection. We also have a book with DC Writers Room people on Wednesday next week. So Donna is the proprietor of the Writers Room. We are featuring 2 of their writers in conversation with Carolyn, right?
Parkhurst.
With Carolyn Parkhurst. And so, yeah, please make sure you come in, go to the events tab on our website, and you'll see the registration page for that. So we hope we'll see you for both of those events next week. And that's us. I'm going to leave the chat up for a minute. I'll stop the recording. If you want to stick around for a bit and say hello to each other, you're welcome to unmute at this point and do so. I just want to thank you all for coming out. This has been great. Donna, thank you so much for joining us, and for all of you for coming and listening.
Thank you.